Hi everyone, this is Mimi Buck doing my final paper presentation for Daniel Robichaud's Ecology, Technology, and Sociology class at Antioch University. My paper is called Save Our Soils, Save the Planet, Restoring Atmosphere and Agriculture with Carbon. Soil expert Graham Sate, in his TED Talk on humus, says that if humans cut carbon emissions tomorrow morning by 100%, in 200 years' time, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere drop down to the levels that we had in 1975. Unfortunately, that's still too warm. And approximately 476 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere is soil carbon. That's almost double the amount emitted by all other forms of emissions. So we need to get that carbon that's in our atmosphere back into the soils. So the dialogue needs to change from eliminating carbon to sequestering carbon. The problem is not carbon itself, it's that the carbon cycle between the ocean, soil, and sky has been disrupted at the soil vector, and it needs to be restored. Carbon on Earth is finite. All the carbon in the air is the same that's been on Earth since its inception. So when we talk about eradicating or eliminating it, which we can't do, you can't eradicate an element. We have to just shuffle it around. So we have to put it somewhere, and where it should go is the soil, where it's most beneficial to us. So restoring soil carbon will not only eliminate the carbon from the atmosphere and reduce global warming. In fact, the Rodley Institute found that recent data from farming systems and pasture trials around the globe show that we could sequester more than 100% of current annual CO2 emissions with a switch to widely available and inexpensive organic management practices, which they term regenerative organic agriculture. But sequestering that carbon from the atmosphere, it will also bolster crop yields and farm profitability, increase nutrient density in our food. Our food right now is only has 20% or less nutrients that our grandparents had. Mitigate or eliminate need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Reduce water usage, lessen chemical pollution into groundwater and the atmosphere, and prevent topsoil loss to erosion and flooding. So what I'll be talking about, and what I talk about in my paper, is what soil is. A lot of people don't even know what basic soil is. When I started this, I didn't realize exactly what it was. It's not just dirt. And how soil works as a carbon sink, which is basically sequestering the carbon. How carbon determines soil fertility. How current agriculture practices are harming the soil, us, and the planet. And what practices and methodologies need to be implemented, and how, on the farm, within the culture, and among governments throughout the world. So the first step to sequestering carbon is photosynthesis, what we learned about in elementary school. According to some people call her the Queen of Dirt, Dr. Christine Jones, every year photosynthesis draws down hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. The movement of carbon from the atmosphere to soil via green plants represents the most powerful tool we have at our disposal for the restoration of soil function and reduction in atmospheric levels of CO2. The process of photosynthesis uses the sun's energy to convert water and carbon from the air into sugars and other organic matter. And 30 to 50% of that matter is released through the roots of the plant to the soil. They're called exudates. And so two factors that determine how much carbon those plants are taking in from the air and exuding into the soil are the amount of plant cover, also known as photosynthetic capacity, so how broad the leaves are and how much canopy there is. And then the other factor is how efficiently they're photosynthesizing, which is called photosynthetic rate. What determines whether or not that carbon is getting sequestered is the presence of microbes in the soil, most notably mycorrhizal fungi. Um, Mycorrhizal fungi attach to plant roots, like root hairs, and expand out. They convert soluble exudates into stable soil carbon compounds known as glomalin. Glomalin. There's a lot of different pronunciations. Glomalin. Um, so the carbon that the plant is taking in, it can't be sequestered unless these microbes are present to sequester it. So the mycorrhizal fungi take the carbon from the plant and turn it into glomalin. And then there's another set of microbes who take the remaining carbon, not taken up by the mycorrhizal fungi, and turn that into a wide variety of stable soil carbon compounds, most notably humus. And humus is considered one of the most complex and important molecules on the planet. In fact, no two are alike. And so these two compounds, glomalin and humus, are important because they represent the most stable fraction of soil organic matter. Stability is essential to sequestration. And so this organic fraction of the soil is also what determines soil fertility. Soil without carbon is just rocks. Carbon, organic matter, the glomalin and humus. And without it, it's just rocks, sand, silt, and clay. And the organic matter is what glues these minerals together and allows the plant to take minerals from them. So the glomalin and humus lump the dirt and all that into, they're called aggregates, they're pea-sized lumps, and the organic matter fuses everything together in a way that allows air and moisture to infiltrate. So it's glued together, but it's kind of an aerated glued together, and that's where the two different, the humus and the glomalin almost acts like a wax, whereas the humus is like a glue. But this is my brother's field of work, and so he was kind of explaining it as almost like an airy cake. And that's what you want your soil to be. So because when they're in these aggregates, it protects from evaporation, it's moisture longer after rain and irrigation, it prevents erosion, we don't have dirt going into water during floods if it's in these aggregates. And so the humus is so necessary for water retention. A 1% increase in organic matter, humus, means that soil can hold 170,000 liters of water per hectare it could not previously hold. That's according to Sate's TED Talk on humus. Soil becomes hard dirt when aggregates break down. They break down due to canopy loss. When the sun is able to bake the soil, it just gases off all that carbon. And then we can't sequester carbon anymore. So then the major issue with current agriculture practices, majority of the farms around the world, they're using chemical fertilizers, monocropping, tilling, various sides, herbicides, pesticides, even the organic ones. All these things are destroying that entire system of soil. So most conventional fertilizers are water-soluble mineral salts in an attempt to satisfy the plant's demand for water-soluble nutrients. So it's mimicking what they've found plants do in a lab, but this is misguided, half-truth science. The most popular form of these fertilizers are nitrogen-based fertilizers, also phosphorus-based. I'm going to use nitrogen as the example. But nitrogen-based fertilizers are everything from like the Cargill stuff to Miracle-Gro. So we're using it in our homes just as often as people are using it in on their farms. So because nitrogen along with phosphorus are naturally taken up by plants and they are necessary to their health, this is why we have nitrogen-based fertilizers. But inorganic nitrogen salts don't have the same effects as soluble organic nitrogen compounds. So inorganic nitrogen are nitrate and ammonium. Organic nitrogen are amino acids and humic compounds. Only 10 to 40% of applied nitrogen in our fertilizers is taken up by the plants. The remaining 60 to 90% is returned to the atmosphere as ammonia or nitrous oxide or leached into aquatic systems as nitrate. And the plants can't even metabolize this inorganic nitrogen as they would organic nitrogen. They're metabolizing it as nitrate or nitrite, and that results in these funny proteins, which are incredibly bad for us. So a lot of people are always looking at their lunch meats going, oh, it contains nitrates, I can't eat this, not knowing that most of our vegetables that we're eating contain those too. So these fertilizers, the biggest problem, other than all the stuff I just said, is that they kill off all the microbes or suppress them. So 90% of our mycorrhizal fungi, which are the most integral part for a plant to take up nutrients and for the carbon exchange, are gone. We've killed off 90% of them. So no longer can also the plants transport organic nitrogen on their own because they don't have the fungi there that transports it for them. So that's why they're constantly needing, it's like a drug addict, they constantly need new nitrogen applied. So kicking that habit is a key thing that we'll talk about later. But another terrible thing for our soils are tilling and monocropping, which are the usual practices. Monocropping is because single crops lack biodiversity. If you have one plant, you only have basically that one plant's kind of microbes. So I'll talk a little bit later about diversity being so important to our soil because you get all those different microbes and they all do different functions and they all take in different nutrients. So if you have less microbes, it means you have lower photosynthetic rate. And then the other thing with monocropping is if you drive by a farm, you see how spaced out all the rows are. What does that allow? It allows sun to come down and bake the soil. So we have low photosynthetic capacity because we have all this space between crops. So it's just baking the soil. And then that leads to tilling because the sun has killed so many things. You have to get air in there. You have to mimic what the aggregates do with the air. So we have to till the soil because it needs air, but because we've killed all the organisms with our nitrogen-based fertilizer, so no, it's called bioturbation is occurring on its own. Bioturbation is just a fancy word for when you have an organic living soil. Real soil is a living thing. You have all these little critters and microbes and bugs crawling in and out, eating stuff, and they're aerating it for you because they're crawling, making little tunnels. So when you have all these fertilizers on it that have killed everything, that's not happening naturally. So you have to constantly till the soil, which exposes more things to the sun and breaks down any of the fungi that it did have. So the whole tilling thing just is a vicious cycle. So what is important to promote carbon sequestration in soils is, number one, diversity. The greater the diversity of plants, the greater the diversity of microbes, and more robust the soil ecosystem, according to Dr. Jones. Multi-species covers up the photosynthetic capacity and photosynthetic rate. It diversifies root systems and keeps the soil covered. You want a mix of broadleaf plants and grass-type plants. So the high and the low, and you want all these different. There's a lot of farmers out there that are just trying all sorts of new things because they find that this radish has this microbe that helps supply this nutrient and keep this guy alive. And so if we have these kind of funky looking crops with all this diversity, then it's actually amazing for building soil that sequesters carbon. So as Jones says, diversity above ground will correlate with diversity below ground. And then results in mass carbon sequestration when you're using these methods. It says an increase of around 5% in global photosynthetic capacity and or global photosynthetic rate would be sufficient to counter CO2 flux from the burning of fossil fuels, provided the extra carbon was sequestered in a stable form. In Jones's native Australia, it would require only 0.5% increase in soil carbon on 2% of our agricultural land to sequester all of Australia's CO2 emissions. So it's really small amounts. We just have to, get all these farms to be working together to do this. Also important, is the shifting towards more perennial-based systems. So perennial plants, those that lived at more than 2 years, trees most notably. So agroforestry systems, which are tree and forest crops, lock carbon in soils and provide carbon through biomass that stays in place for many generations. So the biomass is basically carbon, like, because we're all made of carbon, everything's made of carbon, so it's all the leaves and the branches that are falling continually on the soil from these trees is basically making it into a self-sustaining compost. So it has when you use agroforestry systems, it has least external inputs and yield most output. And then it has also great benefits for wildlife habitats and all this stuff. So, that's you need wildlife. A lot of these farmers that use this encourage wildlife because they're defecating on this stuff and fertilizing it. It's that's why the jungle is so lush. They've got no one tilling this stuff. They've got no one cleaning up after the animals. All this stuff, and they have huge canopy cover. So even though big agriculture corporations try to convince farmers otherwise, these methods that I just outlined are proven to increase profitability and crop yields. So a lot of farmers are kind of scared to jump into this because they think it's going to be too expensive, or it's organic, but is it going to get me my money? But yes, it's more profitable. So a German experiment in which increasing rates of fertilizer were applied to 78 experimental grassland communities of increasing plant species richness. It showed higher diversity was a more important factor for pasture yield than a nitrogen fertilizer. And then a study in the UK found that species-rich pastures averaged 43% higher herbage yields than species-poor pastures. That's according to Jones's work. And then I have another Graham Sate study. It was a comprehensive 3-year study in which they found that the determinant of profitability in agriculture was humus, was how much organic matter you had. Every 0.15% made a significant increase in profitability. There's other benefits to soil carbon other than, saving our atmosphere and better yields and nutrients. I mean, nutrients are the big one. The stuff we're eating right now has no nutrients. Even though you're eating lettuce and you're thinking you're healthy, there's sometimes almost no nutritional value in it because the plants can't take anything from the soil. But so some of the other benefits for carbon sequestration are reduced fossil fuel usage and water conservation, as I had mentioned before. A Bismarck farmer named Gabe Brown, who's very big in this field, and he's one of the guys that's actually putting all of this into practice. He said that it takes an average of 21 gallons of diesel fuel to plant, grow, and harvest an acre of corn. Here, we're doing it in 5. And the reason for this is that the farm is more efficient. When you have more carbon in the soil, you need less acreage. He's actually looking to shrink his farm even more when most farmers are looking to expand because their soil is just so awful. They're constantly having to, they're getting less and less yields, so they need more and more land. He's shrinking his farm every single year and then doesn't need as much fossil fuels to get across the farm. And then, of course, the water conservation aspect. Sate says that 3% of the world's water is fresh and 90% is used for irrigation. So humus is our greatest water management tool. As I mentioned before, 1% increase in soil organic matter means that the soil is holding 170,000 liters of water per hectare. It couldn't before. And so as irrigation issues are one of the leading causes for depleting local water sources, this is another crucial aspect of carbon sequestration. There's a lot of small farms that utilize these practices. The movement is gaining traction. Gabe Brown, the guy I mentioned, he's a big one. Dr. Christine Jones goes all around the world doing this stuff for farmers. And then there was a guy that recently passed away in Japan, Masanobu Fukuoka, and he has a couple great books. and he was known for being the wacky rice farmer who had like the highest yields in Japan, and he didn't touch. He like worked 2 days out of the year because his farm was so self-sustaining, and he didn't have to flood the rice fields, which is what you do if you've ever seen rice fields, because it held water so much. So he never had the same issues that every other rice farmer had, and he never tilled the soil in 20 years. But big agriculture is basically the biggest threat. They're preventing changes on a mass landscape. But there are a lot of people that are looking to change this. We recently had, only 2 years ago, the very first conference on sequestering carbon in soil. That's what it's called, Sequestering Carbon in Soil, Addressing the Climate Threat. And that was in Paris. And there were representatives from all around the globe. It was organized by Breakthrough Strategies and Solutions, which they're a huge education and lobbying foundation for all this work. There's a few other institutions that are doing a lot of work in this area. The Rotary Institute, which I mentioned before, they do research and education. We've actually had a big push for healthy soil laws. California passed one of the most comprehensive ones. They're leading the way, and they put the most money towards it than any state so far, with $7.5 million. Hawaii, New Mexico, Maryland, Oklahoma, and Utah also have healthy soil laws, and then there's proposed ones in New York, Vermont, and Massachusetts. And then there's another foundation called CalCAN, California Climate and Agricultural Network, and they do a lot of education and research and promotion of the need for healthy soils. And as us, the non-farmer or urbanites or suburbanites, they're always looking for volunteers and donations. Donations help, always. Something else we could do personally is composting, for our own gardens. But, Sate was talking about how we need to start lobbying on a bigger scale. We need to lobby our city councils for compost bins. We have green waste bins. We should have compost bins. And then there's companies looking, with this carbon sequestration in mind, they're looking to work with cities so that when a city has a compost, like a whole citywide compost bin, they take that and then they sell it to farmers, or they give it to farmers. So then we're producing compost, this fertile soil, on a mass scale. We have all this biomass that we've collected. Home gardens, of course, help. It seems small, but in that Stan Cox Al Jazeera article we had in class, he mentions that in Bangladesh, where 90% of natural forest cover has been stripped away, more than 20 million home gardens are bringing at least some trees back to the landscape. So small scale, but if we do it enough, it'll all add up. Another huge thing that we can do is rewarding the farmers who do practice regenerative farming practices by buying their products and not using people who use the big chemical agriculture products. Main hurdle to this is all this is still so new and reaching the mainstream, it's hard to find who is doing this stuff. Luckily, we are almost there. There is a new division of the Organic Certifying Agency called Regenerative Organic Certified, and they're in their pilot program right now, but it accounts for soil stewardship and worker livelihood too. There's another grassroots organization that my brother's actually helping get off the ground called Carbon Sink Certification. And it's in its early stages, but it's designed to quantify the amount of carbon farmers are sequestering and compensate through carbon credits. And then we also have a grassroots organization called Regenerative Ecological Agriculture and Landscaping Solutions, or REAL Solutions. This is by Rory Turnbull, who happens to be my brother, and it's a pretty amazing program. He does, and they do a soil analysis and consultations. They educate on how to go about turning your farm or your home garden into a regenerative carbon sequestering landscape. And then he also has a whole production of organic fertilizers. Well, it's not really fertilizers, it's products that rebuild aggregates, restore humus, and cultivate microbial networks. And that can be for the home gardener to the farmer. Those products are available online. And then all the profits go to the Guyzyme Foundation, which is comprised of multiple agricultural and environmental sustainability non-government organizations. And there's also some foundations in South and Central America called La Via Campesina and Mas Humus. Another thing that is important to lobby some of our politicians over is the idea of carbon credits to primary producers of humus. It's already something we do for planting trees, but as humus dictates how efficiently those trees are taking in carbon, that's probably something we should be giving credits to also. And then we also have, as I mentioned, one of the problems is the big agriculture corporations. And although the science behind all this is pretty indisputed, it's been kind of under the radar and it's finally making its way forward. But the only science that is disputing it is the stuff that's being funded by these big agriculture corporations. They're spending billions of dollars lobbying governments and universities to the point where a lot of the research coming out of universities is now considered biased and untrustworthy by those doing the actual research in the literal field, and these soil scientists that aren't tied to anyone and not taking money. So Food and Water Watch listed that Monsanto has representatives on the boards of UC Davis and the Plant Sciences Institute of Iowa State. Cargill has people on the board of University of Georgia. Cargill also gave $10 million to University of Minnesota to create the Cargill Plant Genomics Building, where we do unbiased research. Cargill is a particularly horrible corporation that I would look up. They have tons of human rights abuses as well as abuses to the planet. They're a big agriculture company and they sell fertilizer. Monsanto also has given money and has buildings at University of Arkansas and Missouri, Iowa State. ConAgra has the Foods Inc. lab at Purdue University. So a lot of the stuff coming out of these are singing the praises of GMOs, and the research is pretty tainted. There's a lot of people that come out of Davis saying that GMOs are great, and this is supposed to be one of the top agriculture schools. So we need to be careful about where we're getting the information about our environment. And the people that are actually putting in the work and doing this work are seeing amazing benefits and actually sequestering carbon. It's measurable. The agriculture corporations, they're massive giants to topple, and it is daunting, but the benefits of regenerative farming and carbon sequestration are becoming harder to dispute as big agriculture's chemical farming methods continue to spiral downward. It gets to a point where the soils aren't workable, the pests are out of hand, the yields are low, profitability is non-existent, and consumers' cancer rates soar. So the success stories of the farmers who have made the switch, the proof is in the pudding, and we just need to use our collective energy to help more farmers make this switch so access to better food and clean air and water comes sooner rather than later. All right, thanks for listening, guys. Bye.